I'm intentionally making this a little bit darker than the way that I would sketch it, just so you guys on the edges can see this a little bit better. But when creating a shadow, you need to pick a couple of different, we'll call them angles, and there's all kinds of different ways to refer to this. As I was doing additional research, and looking into the ways that different people talked about this, I was trying to think of ways that I would describe these two angles. Did it disappear? We good? Okay. But we're going to use two different angles, and I'll talk about it in a minute. But what you want to think about is you want to think about the light direction, and I'm going to sketch this in with green. And that light direction is, you're going to use light direction on the surface, essentially, that your shadow is being cast upon. So I'm just going to start in this front left leading edge, front corner, and I'm going to draw in a line that represents my light direction with green. I'm actually going to go ahead and do that here as well. And I've heard different people talk about whether or not you want to have these vanish, or whether or not you should draw them parallel. And my take on that is, again, we're going to talk a little bit about fudging. So in this sense, I would just say you could probably draw them parallel and get away with it. I'm going to go to this back corner and draw a line coming off, again, parallel, representing my light direction. But that isn't enough. So if my light source was over here to the left of this object, bless you, and just shooting this way, then I wouldn't necessarily need to draw this. This would just essentially go off into infinity towards our right vanishing point. But we want to find the light angle. So I've got the light direction. This is the way that shadow is going to be cast on this surface that the cube is sitting on. But my light angle, which I'll represent here, I'm going to have come down. And because of this exercise, I'm actually going to make it a pretty extreme angle. So from this corner, I'm going to sketch a line that represents my light angle. And so to find where this corner hits my surface that the shadow is being cast upon, what I do is I walk from that corner straight down to the ground plane, or the surface that the shadow is being cast on, and then over along the direction, and where that triangle kind of comes in and meets, that's the triangle that I'm interested in. So I'm going to circle, or I'm going to just dot those 3 points. And basically, along this angle to where it hits that direction, that's going to be this point. This is this point on that cast surface. Obviously, this point is just right exactly where it is. The shadow that would cast, since it's sitting on the ground, is right where it is. And I can do a little bit of connect the dots. So if I want to show where this line is, I can connect the dots from there to there. That's the shadow of this front line. Everybody follow so far? So if I want to do it here, again, the steps are take that point, go to the ground plane. I've already drawn in my light direction, and so what I need is the light angle. Again, I'm just going to draw it parallel to this one. Try my best to draw it parallel to that one. And so I'm looking for that triangle. I haven't drawn my light direction over quite far enough. There it is. So if I'm looking at the shadow that's cast by this line, which really doesn't even show up, it's over to there. So now if I want this line and the shadow that's cast by that line, I can go from, we'll call this A and B. This will be A and B. And so this line is the shadow cast by that top edge. Now we'll just do it with that back point. So I'll go ahead and draw in my angle. And you'll notice that I had to ghost in the rest of my cube to get that back point because I come down to the ground plane. That wasn't in my original cube, and then I come over along my light direction until it hits the angle. And so now what I can do is connect the dots between here. This would be point C, and this is C. So I can connect the dots here. And in this instance, and typically what you'll see is that the shadow that's cast, you know, if we think about the way that the light is hitting this cube, it's hitting this surface and this surface the most. It's not hitting this surface very much, and then it's casting this shadow. And what you'll typically see is that this surface will be slightly lighter in value than what the shadow is. So this will be the darkest, less dark. And I'm going to hatch it. And I'm just going to hatch it really tightly. And for some reason, you know, Rusty was asking me how I make a decision on my hatch direction. For some reason, when I do shadows, I like to either do them along one of the angles that I've chosen or just do them vertically. That's really more just personal preference. And then I'm going to hatch this surface just a little bit less dark. And while you guys catch up, I'm just going to clean my drawing up. You might notice that since we've gotten into three-point perspective, you'll see that I'll just kind of choose one or the other. This one's a pretty easy one to do in three-point perspective. Are there any questions? It seems to make sense, right? Cubes, it's super easy. So let's step up the challenge just a little bit. I'm going to draw a shape here. And we're actually going to have the object cast a shadow onto itself. I'm going to put a little angle in here. This is just a simple extrusion. Just a simple extrusion. So in this example, our cube is just sitting on a ground plane. Here we have an object, it's still sitting on a ground plane. In fact, let's start with a simple area over here. So we'll start kind of with what's happening right here. I'm going to choose an angle. Excuse me, I'm going to choose a light direction first. And so it's going to be different than my first light direction. And I want to find this leading edge. I want to find this point. What are my steps to finding that point? I want to find this point right here. What do I do? So, yeah, I mean, I'm going to carry that down to the ground plane because that's where the shadow is going to be. And then I'm going to choose an angle. Let's choose a little bit less of a steep angle this time. And here's my triangle that I need to find that point. So the shadow of this edge is from this point to there. Let's find the back of this. So I'm going to ghost it in. I'm looking for, if this was point A, this will be point B. I'm looking for point B, go down to the ground plane, straight down. This is my light direction. My angle is going to be parallel to that first angle. So there's my triangle back there. So if I'm looking to connect the dots for this edge from B to A, just with the shadow, it's right there. So I don't see much of that shadow, right? I'm going to go ahead and fill it in with a tight hatch. So what do you think we do here? I want to see this tall portion of my extrusion cast onto these three surfaces. What do you think we do? Well, let's pretend there's a little bit of calculation here. And again, what we'll talk about is, do we really go to this extent? I mean, this is almost constructing something completely different. I'm going to pretend like this surface right here is just connected all the way over and is horizontal and flat. And I'll find where this point is on this surface that doesn't fully exist in there. So we'll call this point C. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to drag, or I'm going to think about that going down to the surface now that it's cast on. This is no longer my ground plane. And I want to draw in my light direction parallel to that. There's my light direction. My shadow is being cast along this angle. Oh, it's steep enough to where I've messed this up. Messed up our example, but we'll work through it. So point C is right here. If I wanted to do the same for this back area, I'm going to carry that down and ghost this in. Carry this over. Put my light direction going that way. And my angle coming down from that back point right here. So now this top edge is going to be something like that. What you'll kind of notice is that, and if we look at this first cube, look at this angle relative to that angle, and this angle relative to that angle. They're very similar in how they work out. And in fact, that's one of the ways that you can begin to kind of fudge this, is you just figure out, okay, well, this is probably going to be very close to this angle. I just almost need to find that point, and I can almost construct the rest of it. And you'll recognize that as you do these, go through these exercises. So what I'm disappointed in is I really wanted this shadow to carry across this surface. So we're going to change our
second light source.
we're going to create a second light source, and I'm going to create a new light direction in blue. Yeah, I hadn't really thought about that. This is light 2. Light 2, oops. This is light 2 angle. And so I'm going to change my red to this blue. And I'm going to make it steeper. So let's come off. You know what? Let's not make it exactly like our vanishing line. So here's my new angle. Let me draw that in a little bit darker just so everybody can see it. There's my new angle. Well, I've got my ruler here. I'm just going to go ahead and put another angle for C. Put another angle for this back point that we hadn't defined yet. I'm going to leave the direction. The green is going to be the same. And so now I've changed this triangle up front that gives me this point. So now I've got A2. Now let's find B2. There it is. I've already got my direction in there. And so, you know, to kind of make sure that we see this, I'm gonna make the shadow, the whole shadow in blue. Make sure that we see the edge of this object. So this is B2. Now the question is, what happens, and this is where you can really begin to start to understand what happens with shadows. So this angle's here. We talked about how these angles relate really closely to one another, like this and this, B2 and A2. Well, what about if we were to look at, let's call this point E right here, right? We could construct that, and I'll just do it for the sake of this exercise. I can construct that. I can carry that down to the ground plane. Let's find where that would be. You know, I can construct that. I carried that down to the ground plane. Take my light direction back. Pull this angle down. There's the triangle, so my point E, that shadow would be right there. And I can connect the dots back here between B2 and E2.
Is that on the ground?
That's on the ground plane. But notice this angle of that line relative to this. They're essentially parallel. And so I did go ahead and construct all that, but I probably didn't need to. You'll start to recognize, and I wish I had a hard and fast rule for you as to when you can cheat and be accurate. But I don't. But there's now the shadow of basically this line, and this line. But now what we want to do is I want to cast this second light source from these points, and it's going to hit these surfaces through here. And in fact, we already have the light direction for C. I'm going to label this line, this point back here. This is going to be D. But C, I want to find C2. So pull C down to here, carry C back in this direction. This is C2, but remember, that doesn't really sit on that surface. That's on, if you look really closely, that's sitting on kind of, that's where that would be projected along this surface. Here's that triangle. And so what I really need to do is I need to find where C hits this surface, right? This top surface. Let me, just for the, since I do have a lot of lines on here, let me darken in my object lines for the original extrusion. Okay, so I'm looking for that shadow on this surface. So what I really need to do is I need to extend this surface to where I'm basically making it my ground plane. So I brought that surface over. Let's do it here again. And that's changed where my light source, so when I follow C down to the ground plane, or the surface that it's projecting on plane, I need to change my light direction to this point. Does everybody follow that? So I'm looking at this surface right here. So I want to look at where this tall portion of this extrusion would project onto this surface. So now I'm going to work back from there, my light direction, and I should find where that hits C, right? So just to illustrate the triangle that I'm looking at, I'm going to kind of lightly hatch it in green or red. So I brought C down to the extension of this surface, carried that back along my light direction, and then where the angle, my angle 2 comes down, this point right here gives me C2. And it's being cast along this angle, right? So everything that we've seen so far, from that leading edge going back, it goes back along the angle. So I know that that's there. And we found this point earlier, which actually, if we come down, I know that this is probably right. And so if I carry that along that bottom surface, now what I need to do is look at the connection between this point right here and that. And then, again, I can go through, I can extend this surface over in kind of the, I guess we would call this the X direction, back, the depth, and I could construct exactly where D2 is. But what angle should I reference if I'm looking to create, if I just want to take this and pull it down here, I can almost just take that parallel, just like we did here. This is parallel to that. I can look at C2 and I can just go back in that direction. And that gives me where that shadow is cast. On the top of that object. Now what I can do is I can see if D is back on the ground. So let's follow D down to the ground plane, come along this angle. Is that right? No, it needs to go down further. My ground plane is here. So that direction is there. So I can carry D down, and in fact it does. And what I need to do now is find, we already have an E, so I need to go to F. If I carry point F down to the ground plane, move it along my light direction, and then take an angle from F down to hit right there. Here I've got F2, D2 was right there. And then the direction from this point down here will come this way. So that's where that shadow is hitting the ground plane behind this object. Does everybody see that? I'll make that a little, I'll hatch that in a little less dark.
Edge of that shadow not to need to open up towards the body.
Top edge of this shadow. Tell me where.
So right down, far edge. Oh, well, you were right there. Up.
Here? Here?
Yes, that edge.
It's going to be along this angle, basically.
Now,
So you'll pick up, the weird thing is, and it's hard to see because my drawing has gotten a little muddy, is that there's a little bit of white, and we could call it a highlight, but non-shadow triangle right there that would help define that that's on the ground plane, if it wasn't quite so muddy.
because it's further down, the depth is further to the ground plane, that shadow's gonna cast a little bit further in distance.
Yeah, and since we picked such an extreme angle coming this way, that's why it has further to go to get to that ground plane, and that's why it shows up back there.
Okay.
I think I constructed that correctly. Yeah, Jacob.
So do you want us to use the same angle for all of the hatching in shadows for like a single drawing?
It's a personal preference. You might use a marker. So you might go with like a 60% black marker.
It's probably better not to use a bunch of different hatching angles.
The only reason why I made this different right here is because I wanted to differentiate between what was being cast on the object and what was being cast on the ground. I probably, if I was really paying more attention, I would have made this hatching and that hatching the same and probably made this one a little bit different.
And the ground one would probably be a little bit darker because it's further away, which means there's probably more ambient light getting to it. there may be even slightly different shadow strength on those different
Surfaces.
surfaces.